In 1906, the United States government sealed off a mountain in northern Arizona. For the next 11 years, it closed that ground to the public, cleared it of every predator its trappers could find, and let no outside eyes see what was happening up there. And when the record of those 11 years was finally pieced back together, it did not describe the paradise they'd promised. It described something no one has ever been able to explain. They called it the Kaibab Plateau. A forested island of pine and meadow lifted 9,000 feet above the desert, walled off from the world by 100 miles of red sand on 3 sides, and the deepest canyon on Earth on the 4th. They were going to make it a sanctuary, a place where the deer would be safe forever. So beginning in 1907, they killed every wolf, every mountain lion, every coyote they could hunt down, and they closed the plateau. And for 11 years, the herd grew behind that closure, unwatched, until some said there were 100,000 of them up there, more deer than anyone had ever seen in one place in their lives. And then, across 2 winters, 60,000 of them died. You have probably been taught why. It's in the biology textbooks, the famous lesson of the Kaibab, the tidy little parable of what happens when foolish men remove the predators and let a herd outgrow its food. The deer starved. Nature corrected the imbalance, cause and effect. A closed case, taught to school children for 100 years. Except the man who walked out onto that plateau every morning to count the bodies wrote down something the textbooks leave out. The animals weren't starving. He'd kneel over them in the snow, healthy deer, fat still on them, food still in their stomachs, lying in the open, in good country, within reach of grass and water, whole and untouched, not clawed, not bled, not gutted, not even fed on afterward, on a plateau still crawling with coyotes and ravens that should have stripped a carcass to bone inside a day. As if nothing up there would go near them. They had simply lain down in a paradise, folded their legs, put themselves on the ground, and never gotten up again. He counted them by the 1,000, and in a book he kept in his coat, in his own careful pencil hand, he wrote down what he thought was really happening on that mountain, a second private count that he could never turn in to the government, because the government had already decided what the number was supposed to be. That book survived, complete, front to back, except for the last several pages, which have been torn out, cleanly, close to the spine, removed by someone who knew exactly which pages he wanted no one ever to read. This is what was in the rest of it. The book is a standard Forest Service field ledger, grey-green cloth cover, ruled pages, the kind of thing every ranger and every clerk on every district carried in a coat pocket in those years. This one belonged to a young man assigned to the North Kaibab Ranger District, and it covers the seasons from the spring of 1923 to the winter of 1926. His job was the census. He counted deer. That sounds like nothing. It sounds like the most boring assignment the Forest Service could hand a young man. Walk out, count animals, walk back, write the number down, do it again tomorrow. But you have to understand what was happening on the Kaibab in those years, to understand why that plain little book matters more than almost anything else that survived from it. The deer counts from this period are, to this day, considered unreliable. Historians who have gone back through the record have found that almost every number anyone ever quoted about the Kaibab herd, the 4,000 at the start, the 100,000 at the peak, the 60% that supposedly died, traces back to a guess. An estimate laid on top of an estimate laid on top of a rumor, until nobody could say anymore where any of it had come from. There was only one source of numbers on that whole plateau, with any continuity from one year to the next. One office that actually kept a running count, instead of throwing out a figure and moving on to something else. And this book is a working man's copy of exactly those counts. The raw tally, the real number written down in pencil in the field, before anyone in an office in Washington ever decided what the number ought to be. It is complete, front to back, in a careful, patient hand. A man who took the work seriously, a man who did not leave things out, except for the last several pages, which have been torn out. I'll come back to those pages, because they are the whole reason this story is a mystery, instead of a footnote. But first, you need to know what the man was counting, and how a young clerk who loved his job more than anything ended up keeping two different sets of numbers in the same book, one for the government, and one he could never show a living soul. His first spring on the district, he was certain he had the best job in the United States. I want to be fair to him, because everything that comes later is easier to sit with if you understand that this was a young man who loved that plateau and believed in the work he was doing. He wasn't a hardened old ranger. He was new and he was proud, and the assignment that everyone else on the district thought was tedious, walking out to count deer before breakfast, was, to him, the finest thing a man could be paid to do. He rode out from the ranger station near Jacob Lake in the cold dark, up through the Ponderosa in the grey before dawn, and he reached the big meadows just as the first light came down through the trees. The parks, they called them. The wide open grasslands that break up the forest on the Kaibab. VT Park, DeMott Park. Long green openings a mile across, ringed with pine, and in the early morning they filled with deer coming out of the timber to feed while the frost was still white on the grass. He counted them, and some mornings there were so many that he lost his place, genuinely could not hold that many animals in his eye at once, and had to stop and start the whole transect over from the beginning. He wrote in the book that he had never imagined there could be so many deer in one place in all the world. He wrote that a man could stand at the edge of DeMott Park at sunup and feel like he was looking at the morning of creation. He worked alongside 3 men, and I'm going to tell you about them, because they matter to what happened. The first was an older packer named Hollis, a local, one of the ranching families that had run stock on the plateau before the government closed it, and a man who had hunted the Kaibab his whole life, back when a man was still allowed to. Hollis could read a meadow the way you or I read a page of print. He'd crouch at the edge of a park and tell the clerk where the animals had bedded down in the night, which direction they drifted at dawn, whether something had moved them, or whether they'd gone easy. He was patient with the young man, and he taught him to see, and the clerk came to trust him more than anyone on the district. The second was a young ranger about the clerk's own age named Cobb, out of Kanab, over in Utah. Cobb never stopped talking. He talked through breakfast, and he talked on the trail, and he talked at the fire until someone told him to give it a rest. He carried hard candy in his coat pocket, and he handed it out to anyone who looked cold or tired or low, without ever being asked. The clerk wrote in the book that Cobb was the kind of man who made a hard day feel shorter just by being on it with you. And the third was a Kaibab Paiute man named Sam Frank, who packed for the district. Sam Frank was the opposite of Cobb. He said almost nothing, and what he did say was worth listening to. He knew that country in a way that went back long before there was a forest service or a game preserve or a single white rancher on the plateau. And the clerk noticed something about him early on and wrote it down because he wrote everything down. Sam Frank would not make his camp in certain of the parks, no matter how good the grass was, no matter that the water was close and the ground was flat and it was the obvious place to stop. He'd move on and make a poorer camp somewhere else, in worse country, and sleep there instead. And once, when the clerk asked him why, Sam Frank looked at the park they'd just passed through, the pretty one with the good water, and he said only that it wasn't a good place to sleep, and he wouldn't say anything more about it. The clerk thought that was just an old man's superstition, a habit from the old days. He wrote it in the book the way you'd note the weather, and then he didn't think about it again for a long time. But I want you to hold on to it, because Sam Frank had walked that plateau his whole life, and he knew which meadows a man should not close his eyes in, and he knew it long before there was a single dead deer to explain why. Now, the Kaibab Plateau is a strange piece of ground when you look at it on a map, and you need to see it clearly to understand the rest. It sits up high, 9,000 feet, forested and green and cool, a slab of pine and aspen and meadow lifted up above the desert. And it is surrounded on 3 sides by red rock desert that runs for 100 miles, dry country that would kill most things trying to cross it on foot, and on the 4th side, the south side, by the largest canyon on the face of the earth, a mile deep, 10 miles across, the Grand Canyon itself. So the Kaibab is an island, a forested island in a sea of stone and sand. Nothing walks onto it by accident, and nothing walks off of it easily. Whatever lives up there because it belongs to that place, cut off, hemmed in, held on that green tabletop by desert on 3 sides and the abyss on the 4th. It is one of the most isolated pieces of high country in North America. And that isolation is going to matter, because when things started dying up there was nowhere for them to have come from, and nowhere for whatever killed them to have gone. And in those years, more than anything else, what lived on the Kaibab was deer. They were up there in those numbers because of a decision made in Washington almost 20 years before the clerk ever set foot on the plateau. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt set the whole Kaibab aside as the Grand Canyon National Game Preserve. It was to be a sanctuary, a place where the deer were protected, where no hunting was allowed, where the herds could grow fat and safe. And to make it a true sanctuary, the government decided the deer needed protecting not just from hunters, but from everything that ate them. So the Forest Service went to war on the predators, and it was a real war, fought year after year, and it was thorough. Beginning in 1907, government trappers and hunters worked that plateau season after season, killing everything that might take a deer. And by the time they were finished, the tally was staggering. I want to give you the real numbers, because the real numbers are worse than anything I could invent. 816 mountain lions killed, 20 wolves, the last 20 wolves the region would ever have. There have been none since. More than 7,300 coyotes, over 500 bobcats, every one of them hunted down, trapped, poisoned, or shot, and hauled off that plateau, one carcass at a time, across a span of more than 30 years. The entire predator population of the Kaibab systematically erased so that the deer could be safe. And here is the thing I need you to really sit with, because it is what makes everything that comes after so hard to bear. The clerk thought this was good work. Everyone did. They believed they were saving something. They'd stand at the edge of DeMotte Park at dawn and look out at a meadow that was almost solid with deer, more animals than any of them had ever seen, more than their fathers had seen, more than would ever be seen there again. And they were proud of what they'd built. They believed they had made a paradise on that plateau, a safe place, a sanctuary, exactly as they'd been told to. They had no idea what they had actually done. They had taken an island sealed off by desert and canyon, and they had removed every single thing that kept the balance on it. and they had done it so completely that when the balance finally broke, there was nothing left up there to break it against. Nothing natural anyway. Nothing anyone could name. The clerk didn't know any of that yet. That first spring, he just counted his deer and loved his job and filled the pages of his book with the biggest numbers anyone on that district had ever written down. The trouble started the following year, and it started, of all things, as an arithmetic problem. Late in his second season, the clerk ran a transect he had run 100 times before. The same meadow, the same starting point at the same corner of the park, the same hour of the morning, in weather so close to identical that it made no difference at all, same temperature, same still air, same frost. He walked it, and he counted, exactly the way he always had. Then, 3 days later, under those same unchanging conditions, he walked it and counted again. And the two counts were off by more than the herd could possibly have changed in 3 days. Not by a little. Not by the handful you'd expect from an animal or two drifting between drainages. By a lot. More animals than could have been born in 3 days. More than could have died. More than could have wandered in from the next park, over in that short a stretch of time. The number had moved in a way the number was not supposed to be able to move. He assumed he had made a mistake. That is the honest professional thing to assume, and he was an honest professional young man. A census clerk who cannot count is no use to anybody, and he was the newest man on the district, and this census was his responsibility, and nobody else's. So he recounted, carefully, twice, slowing down, checking himself. It happened again, and then he noticed the thing that no amount of recounting could fix, the thing that made his stomach go cold. On a transect, you walk out and you walk back. You count going and you count coming. Same ground, twice, so you can check yourself against yourself. And he began to find animals on the return leg that had not been there on the way out, in open meadow, in full daylight. On ground he had walked across not 20 minutes before, ground he had already counted, ground with nothing on it. Not standing at the tree line where he might have missed them in the shadow of the pines, not drifting in from cover, standing in the open, in the middle of the park. On grass he had personally walked over and counted as empty a quarter of an hour earlier, where nothing could have crossed all that open ground without him seeing it move. He told no one. I want you to understand exactly why, because it is not the reason you might think. It wasn't bravery, and it wasn't stupidity. It was that he was the census man. The count was the one thing in the world he was there to get right. It was his whole job and his whole worth on that district. And a census clerk who walks into the ranger station and tells the supervisor that deer are appearing behind his back in empty meadows in broad daylight is a census clerk who is quietly put on the next wagon out and never trusted with a number or a job again. So he did the only thing that let him keep his job and keep his mind at the same time. He turned to the back of the book behind all the official pages, and he started a second column. The real count, the one he actually saw, the one he could never, ever turn in. And in the morning, in the cold and the dark, he got up and walked the transects again. Now, if the clerk had gone to the men running that plateau and told them what was happening, they would have had answers ready, because by the mid-1920s, everyone knew something was wrong with the Kaibab herd. Deer were dying. That part was no secret. The only question anybody was asking was what was killing them. And every answer they had, the clerk watched to come apart in his own hands, out in the timber, over a carcass, one at a time. They said the deer were starving. And on paper, that made sense. It's the answer in every textbook to this day. The range was wrecked. By 1923, the official reports were describing the condition of the plateau as deplorable. The forage eaten down to bare dirt, the brush stripped, the young aspen and fir chewed off as high as a deer could stretch to reach. 100,000 mouths on ground that could feed 30,000. Starvation should have been the whole story, but the animals told him otherwise. He'd open one up to check, that was part of the work, to see what condition they were in, and he'd find a full stomach. Fat still on the kidneys, an animal that had been eating, that had reserves left, that was not, by any measure he knew, starving. Whatever had put that deer down in the meadow, it had not been hunger. Not that one, not most of the ones he checked. So they said it was the winters. And the 2 winters that came were hard ones, 1924 into 1925, and then 1925 into 1926. Back to back. Cold, deep snow, a long time before the melt. But they were not the worst winters anyone on that plateau had ever lived through. Not by a long way. The proof was down below. The cattle and horses wintering in House Rock Valley, out on exposed ground with far less shelter than the timbered plateau, came through those same 2 winters. A hard winter kills the weak and the old and the very young at the ragged edges of a herd. It does not do what the clerk was seeing. It does not lay healthy animals down in the open in the middle of good country. So they said disease, but there was no disease to find. No lesions, no sores, no swellings, no wasting, no pattern, and disease always makes a pattern, running through a family group, following a drainage, taking the old before the young, or the young before the old. There was none of that. He was not finding sick animals that sickened and then died. He was finding healthy animals that were simply, suddenly dead, scattered without pattern across ground where nothing should have been able to kill them. So they said hunters. Hunting had been reopened in the fall of 1924, after the long closure of the plateau was finally lifted, and men had come, and men had taken deer, 675 of them, that first reopened season. Which sounds like slaughter until you set it beside the birth rate. Those 675 deer were roughly 1/10 of the fawns born on the plateau that single spring. A drop in a bucket that was overflowing. And in any case, the carcasses the clerk was finding out in the timber were not a hunter's work, and no one who had ever seen a hunted deer could have pretended otherwise. They weren't gutted, they weren't bled, they weren't dragged toward any trail or road, they weren't shot, they hadn't been touched by a human being at all. So finally, they said the predators must have come back. And that was the one that should have made sense. That was the one the clerk almost wanted to believe. Because it was natural. It was ordinary. It was a thing that happened in the world. Take away 800 lions, and sooner or later something moves in to eat the surplus. A returning predator would explain the deaths. Except the predators were gone. The government had the tally to prove it. 816 lions, 20 wolves, 7,000 coyotes, all of it written down, all of it dead. And more than that, around the carcasses he found, there was nothing. No predator does this. A lion covers a kill and comes back to it. A pack feeds and leaves the bones scattered and cracked. Coyotes and ravens and every scavenger on the plateau find a dead deer within a day and take it apart. But these animals lay in the open, whole, not fed on, not opened, not even scavenged after death, as though nothing on that plateau, not lion, nor coyote, nor raven, nor beetle, wanted to be the thing that touched them. They were just there, intact and dead. Every explanation a reasonable man could offer, the clerk carried out into the timber laid down next to a carcass, and watched die. And then there was the trapping. And I need to tell you about the trapping in detail because it is real, it is in the record, and it is the single worst thing in this whole story. Somebody in the government had a sensible sounding idea. If the deer were too many, why kill them? Why not simply catch them and ship them somewhere the herds were thin and let everyone come out ahead? So box traps were built, wooden crates baited, set out across the plateau to catch deer alive and unharmed for transport. And the results were written down. And here they are. Exactly. 18 deer were caught in the traps. Of those 18, 8 died. Not shipped and died. Not injured in handling. They died in the box. They died of fright, or they beat themselves to death throwing their own bodies against the walls of the trap, trying to get out. Most of the remaining animals were so wild with terror that they could not be moved at all and had to be turned loose on the spot. And in the end, out of 18 deer caught alive on the Kaibab Plateau, exactly 1 reached the railroad. 1. The clerk read that report, and there was a question he could not put down afterward, a question that followed him out onto the transects in the morning and lay next to him at night. What does an animal have to be afraid of already before it is ever caught, before a man ever lays a hand on it, walking out to feed in those pretty meadows every dawn like nothing is wrong? What does it have to be carrying inside it, to be so far gone with fear that a simple wooden box is the thing that finally stops its heart? They were already terrified, all of them. Out there in that paradise, in the safest place for a deer in all of North America, the herd was dying of a fear that had nothing to do with any trap, and the trap just happened to be the thing that showed it. In the autumn of 1924, a committee came up from outside. Men chosen deliberately because they had no connection to the Forest Service, brought in for that exact reason, because by then, no one entirely trusted the service's own account of what was happening on its own plateau. They wanted the numbers. They wanted the census. The clerk handed over his ledger. He handed over the official column. The clean one. The one that showed the deer thinning out the way starving deer are supposed to thin out. He did not show them the column in the back of the book. He did not tell them about the animals that appeared on empty ground in daylight. He did not tell them that the count had stopped obeying arithmetic. He handed the important men the numbers they had come for, and he kept the true ones to himself, and he told himself he was protecting his job. He was protecting more than his job. He just didn't have a word yet for the thing he was protecting them from. You already know how the drive ended. Now I'll tell you what it was like to stand inside it. The clerk was put on the line with the rest, out on the north rim in the falling snow, 1 man in a chain of more than 100 strung through the timber. Ahead of them, the Paiute and Navajo crews moved forward on foot, ringing the cowbells, and the whole vast apparatus of men and horses and noise began to close on the herd to push it toward the lip of the canyon. And the deer would not go. Understand what that means on the ground, because the textbooks make it sound like slapstick, the silly notion that you could herd wild deer, failing the way silly notions fail. It was not like that to be there. These were not tame animals merely reluctant to be handled. This was a herd on a plateau, where, as the clerk had been writing in the secret back pages of his book for 2 full seasons now, the animals no longer behaved the way animals are supposed to behave. They did not flee the men and the bells and the horses the way a driven herd flees, braking and running ahead of the pressure. They milled, they turned, they broke sideways through the line. They stood in place and would not move at all. And more than 100 hard, experienced men, riders and packers, and lifelong hunters who had moved cattle and stock their whole lives, could not make that herd go toward the rim, no matter what they did, no matter how they shouted or closed the gap or rang the bells. Hollis, the old packer, had driven cattle since he was a boy. The clerk looked over at him in the middle of it and saw him rein his horse to a dead stop and just sit there in the snow, looking at the milling herd with an expression the clerk never forgot for the rest of his life. It was not frustration. It was not a cattleman annoyed that the drive was failing. It was something quieter and much worse. It was the face of a man who has just understood the answer to a question he had spent a long time being afraid to ask out loud. Hollis looked at those deer that would not be driven, and he knew something, and he never said what it was. The drive collapsed. Everyone knows that part. Not one deer took the trail. The forest supervisor called it the most interesting failure he'd ever seen, and it went into the history books as a joke. What did not go into the history books is what happened when the crews came down off the line. The Paiute and Navajo men who had been hired to walk that plateau on foot, closest to the ground, closest to the herd, and who had done it without a word of complaint through the rain and the sleet and the snow and the thunder, came off that rim and would not go back onto it. Not the next day, not the day after, not for more pay when it was offered. Sam Frank, the packer, who had never once made his camp in certain of those pretty meadows, gathered his own people together, and they came down off the Kaibab, and they were gone. They had been out there on foot in the middle of it, closer to whatever it was than any man on a horse, and whatever they had understood, standing in that snow among deer that would not run. They had decided that no amount of a white man's money was worth staying up there to understand any further. And Zane Grey, who had come all that way to make a film that would show the whole country the great deer drive of the Kaibab, the spectacle, the triumph of man over the wilderness, took the reel of film he had shot out there on the rim, and when it came to nothing, he threw it away below the edge in disgust. A reel of motion picture film, exposed on that plateau in those days, in that snow, by one of the most famous men in America, pointed at that herd and those men and whatever was out there among them. Gone. Discarded somewhere down below the North Rim in the winter of 1924. Never recovered, never developed, never seen by a single living person from that day to this one. Nobody has any idea what was on it. What follows is drawn from the winter counts, the tallies made across the 2 hard winters as the die-off ran its course. I'm going to give it to you the way it was recorded, in the flat language of a man doing grim paperwork, because the way it was recorded is the most frightening thing about it. There is no drama in these entries. That's what makes them terrible. The counts were made by drainage. Carcasses located, tallied and logged, condition, sex, age class, position on the ground, distance from the nearest available feed, ordinary field work, a clerk with a book, walking dead ground, writing numbers. The animals were not concentrated at the edges of the range. That is the first thing the record shows, and it is the first thing that is wrong. When a herd starves, the dead pile up at the margins, the poorest ground, the last places with any feed, where the weakest animals drift and fail. But these were found throughout, in the good country and the poor country alike, in the rich parks and the thin timber both, scattered evenly across the whole plateau, without regard for where the feed was or wasn't. Many were logged within easy reach of standing forage, some within sight of open water, animals that had, by the plain evidence of where they lay, everything they needed to live, and had died anyway. Stomach contents, where the entries note them, were in a great many cases not consistent with starvation. Food in the gut, reserves on the body. The register says it without alarm. one entry after another in the same hand. This animal was not starving, and this one, and this one. External injury, none noted in most. No predation sign, no claw, no tooth, no drag, no scavenging sign. And read that twice, because it is the strangest line in the whole record. Across an entire plateau, across 2 winters, across tens of thousands of carcasses, the notation again and again is that the body was intact and undisturbed. Nothing had fed on these animals. Nothing had opened them after death. On a plateau still full of coyotes and ravens and every hungry scavenging thing, the dead lay whole in the snow and were left alone. And the position. The register records animal after animal lying as though it had lain down, not fallen mid-stride, the way a running animal drops, not crumpled in flight, lain down, folded its legs, put itself on the ground in the open, in good country, within reach of food and water, and not gotten up again. That is the picture the government's own field counts paint, if you read them closely. Not a herd that starved, a herd that lay down in a paradise and quietly stopped. And the total, when the government gathered it all up and rendered it into a single figure the country could be given, was this: an estimated 60,000 deer, dead across 2 winters, a herd of 100,000, cut by 60%, the great Kaibab die-off, the lesson that every biology student in America has been taught for 100 years since, the neat little parable of what happens when foolish man removes the predators and lets a herd outgrow its range, until nature punishes the imbalance with mass starvation. Cause and effect, tidy, closed, except. That 60%, the number in every textbook, the number that anchors the whole famous lesson, was never counted. It was extrapolated. Trace it back to its source, all the way back, and the great collapse of the Kaibab herd rests on a single visitor's rough estimate of a decline, from which someone worked out a percentage, from which an entire nation built a fable. It has been repeating ever since. And the one man who actually kept a continuous year-over-year count of that herd, the forest supervisor, whose running tally was the only figure on the entire plateau with any real consistency from one year to the next, reported something else entirely. He did not report 100,000 deer collapsing to 40. He reported a population of roughly 30,000 animals, and he reported it holding more or less steady straight across the very years of the supposed catastrophe. Through 1924, through both hard winters, through the die-off that is said to have killed 60,000 deer, his numbers barely move. So sit with what that actually means, because it is the thing this whole story has been walking toward. The official continuous record of the Kaibab Plateau does not say that 60,000 animals starved to death. The only steady year-by-year count anyone ever kept up there says that in those years, on that plateau, essentially nothing happened at all. One of those two things is a lie, and the clerk, out in the timber, kneeling over whole, intact, healthy animals that had lain down in the snow and died with nothing to have killed them, the clerk knew that neither one of them was the truth. 3 things were never resolved. I'm not going to pretend to resolve them for you now. The first is the film, Zane Grey's reel, thrown away below the North Rim in December of 1924. It has never been found. Whatever those cameras caught of that plateau, that herd, that drive, and those men on foot who would not go back up afterward, is still down there somewhere in the rock, or gone to dust decades ago, and no living person has ever seen a single frame of it. We know it existed. We know where it was lost. We do not know, and now may never know, what was on it. The second is the count, the forest supervisor's continuous figures, the steady 30,000, the numbers that quietly say the great die-off never happened the way the whole country has been taught it did, were set aside, passed over, superseded by the number that made the better lesson, the cleaner parable, the story that fit, never formally retracted, never called wrong, just not the number anyone chose to carry forward. The true count of the Kaibab is sitting in the record right now, and it does not match the story, and almost no one has ever bothered to notice. And the third is the book. The clerk's ledger survived, complete, front to back, in his careful, patient pencil hand, the official column that he handed to the important men, and behind it, in the back, the second column. The real count, the one he saw, the one he could never turn into a living soul, except for the last several pages. The pages covering the final weeks before he left that district are torn out. Not lost, torn. Cleanly, close to the binding, removed by someone who knew exactly which pages he wanted gone and left every other page in place. We do not have them. We do not know what was written on them. We know only this, that a man who wrote down everything, a man who could not stop himself from recording even an old Paiute packer's refusal to close his eyes in a pretty meadow, a man who filled a book with the truth he was too afraid to say out loud. That man wrote something on those final pages. And then he, or someone who came after him, decided that whatever it was, no one else should ever be allowed to read it. Officially, the deer of the Kaibab died of starvation. Officially, the government's own continuous count says nothing happened on that plateau between 1924 and 1929. 60,000 animals disagree. They lay down whole and healthy in a paradise and died of a fear no one could name, and nothing on that plateau would so much as touch them afterward. And the one man who was sent up there to count them tore out the last thing he had to say about it, and carried it with him, and took it into the ground. Whatever he saw on the Kaibab in those final weeks, it is still up there, sealed off by desert on 3 sides and the deepest canyon on earth on the 4th, on an island in the stone, waiting for the next man who decides he wants to know exactly what the numbers were.